So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Welcome to Poetry and Politics 2. I'm Liana Cusmano, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm located on unceded Indigenous lands. Shoshage, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and we acknowledge them and other nations who care for the land across our country, recorded and unrecorded. It's important that we pay our respects to Canada's first storytellers and to the lands that hold us and carry us as we go about our lives with our common goals. And I think, and that's one thing I'm probably going to mention today, is how important it is that we constantly question our own biases and convictions, and how we radically, il faut qu'on se remette en question as often as possible, that we radically question where we come from and the way we do things, because the world is so big and so many of our experiences and identities don't intersect until a certain stage in our lives. And that's where conflict can happen. And that's what some of my poems are going to be addressing, because sites of conflict can be anywhere. They can be in your grandmother's kitchen, they can be in your parents' house, they can be with your friends out on the street. But I'm going to start off with something short, and by saying that I submitted a poem once to a contest or a publication, and I sent it in and I got a response that said, "Thank you for your submission. We are unable to accept it at this time because this is not poetry. This is flash fiction." And my whole world just tilted. I was like, oh no, I've been writing something completely different for all these years that I wasn't even aware. I had an anonymous person on the other end of an email chain tell me that my work is flash fiction and I didn't even know about it. So I think it's poetry. I'll read it and all of you can judge for yourselves. Is this a poem? Is this something you put on a sticky note? Is this an anthem? What is this? I'll read it. And then if you have questions about it, please put them in the chat and we'll discuss. He says, "I love you." And I think, where are you going? When will you be back? I love you is something you say before you leave, before you hang up the phone, before you go away for a little while. It's like a parting gift. Remember this while I'm gone, that I love you. I remember that I love you is a gift. It exists in a present that is constantly shifting. People come and go. They are here and not here. They are leaving and arriving. He has begun to say, I love you when he wakes up, when he arrives, when he walks into the room. It is a gift he brings with him when he is here, and a present he leaves behind for when he is away. So that starts us off. And I want to thank everybody again for being here. I think it's especially important now in draconian circumstances with curfews before the sun goes down and people who think, they can light things on fire in the old port, et cetera, that we have moments where we can all come together and share poems and feelings. I give poetry and writing workshops to elementary school students and high school students. And it's interesting to compare the two of them. The high school students, especially, and it's different if I as a facilitator am in the classroom, which I'm not, and it's different whether all the kids are in one place or whether they're all tuning in by Zoom. So it's different every time. But the high school kids are usually a little bit more reserved, a little bit more nervous about sharing their feelings. One thing I remember from one student, he was working on a poem and he couldn't strike the tone he wanted. And so he asked me to sort of talk to him and he said, I'm going for the tone, and he goes, I don't know how to do this. I'm not sure, but what I want is a poem that is like that feeling when you slide into a girl's DMs on Instagram, when you're writing to someone online and you don't know them, but you've seen their pictures and you think they're really cool. And I'm like, I don't know if I can help you with this, but let's talk about it and we'll all do our best. The elementary school kids, you can't get them to be quiet. They just go on and on and on. There are times when I have to close the speakers list because they've gone off on have roles, and each of them has 88,000 things to say about gender roles, and it's great. It's fantastic. And they have no filter. So I'll read something and then one kid will just pipe up and say, did you write that? And I'll say, yes, I did. And he goes, all by yourself? I'll say, yes, I wrote it all by myself. He's like, it's very sad. I'll be like, okay, thank you. He's not wrong. So with that in mind, I'm going to read a piece that I have not read for any elementary school students or any high school students either, but it's a little bit sad. So that's your fair warning. She's a smoker. I know this when I meet her in the bar and kiss her cheek and try to pretend that my hands aren't shaking. The bartender offers us beer and I don't ask him whether they've got anything stronger like shoe polish or bleach. Later, in the small, dimly lit room that smells of cigarettes and something sad, I know that when I lie down on the bed and stretch out my limbs, I'll be able to touch the desk on my left with my hand and poke the bathroom door on my right with my toes. I let the fine strands of her dark hair slide through my fingers and I undo her bra with one hand, which is a lot less impressive when you've been wearing one for most of your life. I dimly register that her kisses are soft and gentle and shallow. We fall onto the bed like a wall coming down in a ruined city, and I'm relieved that this is shallow, that I will survive this, that I am not going to drown in this fetid, airless room. We make love with a strange intimacy that is wordless and unhurried, and the seamless transition from sex to sleep is devoid of any traditional markers of care. Words like, are you comfortable? Are you cold? Can you fall asleep if someone is holding you? We never hold one another. Instead, I have my arm around her in a way that's warm but also careless, a way that to me would have felt haphazard and inauthentic. We don't know one another well enough to say or do anything that will really hurt or really matter. This, our physical interpretation of what it means to be affectionate, is comforting to me not because it's unconditional, but because it's indiscriminate, as we share this bed and fall asleep side by side. This girl will never tell me that she doesn't want to be with me anymore. This girl will never leave and not come back. That was somebody else, someone who used to lie beside me in another bed at another time, and I would watch her while she slept because I wanted to remember what she looked like before she disappeared. I still remember what she looks like, even after she dropped me like a burden on a mountaintop, like a rock in a river, like a stone that you leave behind so that you won't drown. I still remember what she looks like, and I'm still afraid that I'm going to drown again. I'm still afraid that I'm drowning, even when I wake up in the morning in that tiny room with somebody else, in another bed with another girl. Her dark hair is fanned over the pillowcase. Her chest is moving up and down. Her left hand is on my thigh. Somehow fevered and breathless and afraid of drowning, even after all this time, I know that I'm not going to rub her back or wander naked in her apartment or feel her eyes on me as the sunlight filters through the windows. I feel a steely reassurance, like cold iron, when I remember that I'm not going to ask for more than she can give. There is not enough depth here to allow for that, and I feel an empty, desiccated relief for this place that I have come to with nothing to offer and nothing to lose. I get up, I get dressed, I leave. I never watched her as she slept. I don't remember what she looks like. I took part in a project called the Transformations, the Italian Canadian Experience, which is an accumulation of records and testimonials about the Italian Canadian experience and how so many of us are here because of the people who came before and where they came from. And so we'll be putting the link to that in the chat. And the piece that I submitted is an adaptation of a piece called Boyfriend, which originally appeared in my chapbook, AICW. And this is an elaboration and an adaptation of that same story. And so, and adaptations, and it's interesting because as a poet and as a writer, so many of us draw from obviously what we know. And I think it's important to stay in your lane. Don't try to talk about things that you haven't experienced or sort of insert yourself into places where you don't belong. Be aware of the good fortune that you have and the space that you occupy and what you can do with your platform to have an impact on other people or the people in your community. And it's interesting because when you write about queerness or about family or about politics, all these things are constantly shifting all the time. And so to readapt and to realign yourself with what's happening can be something that I know I need to think about as an artist and as a poet and say, okay, these circumstances have radically changed, but I've been writing about this one thing for so long about, let's say, queerness or about our relationships to our bodies or my relationship to my body. And so when that changes, how do I reflect that in how I write? And is that a betrayal of the way I've been writing about it before? And it's not. It's just growth. It's just adaptation and accommodation. So with that in mind, this piece is called Boyfriend. My grandmother is tiny and old and Italian, and she knows just enough English to ask me, so, you have a boyfriend? For my grandmother, the Italian word for boyfriend is the same as the Italian word for fiance. And so the best way for my grandmother to strike out in the dark along a linguistic path littered with landmines is for her to use English words that are as unfamiliar to her as the concept of being with someone, even when you have no intention of marrying them. Every time my grandmother and I have a conversation about a boyfriend, I know that each of us will be reminded of just how many things we don't understand. We are as close as two people can be when they're part of one family that's split between two different worlds, like two different types of pasta sauce, like members of two different generations. My grandmother doesn't understand why I can't just do things the way she did and the way her mother did and the way my mother did, as if we were all objects on an assembly line instead of items crafted by hand. When I say to my grandmother that I have something important to tell her, she asks me if I'm pregnant. When I tell her that I'm bisexual, that I'm queer, when I tell her about men and women and people and about how much love I have to give, she says that she would have preferred it if I'd been pregnant. When I tell my grandmother that I'm dating someone small, gorgeous, female, and Jewish, she groans like she can see the faraway specter of her healthy, Catholic, bilingual great-grandchildren rapidly disappearing into nothingness. My grandmother doesn't see the simple elegance of my own devastation when she says, wouldn't it be better for each of you if you had a man instead of one another? Wouldn't it be better for this girl if she had a man instead of having you? And the words in my mouth are like stones in my pockets when I say neither one of us wants a man right now. If we've chosen one another over every other man, woman, person, haven't we already proved that each of us is enough? Doesn't that prove that I am enough, just as I am? My grandmother has always made me feel like I will always be more than enough. It's only when we broach the topic of the boyfriend that I start to believe that maybe there are exceptions. It's only when we discuss the concept of the boyfriend that I understand that I will have to pick and choose which of my grandmother's words and thoughts and actions I will allow to affect me, because the alternative is to be fractured and splintered by her opinion on something she can't and doesn't and will never understand. My grandmother doesn't see the simple elegance of my own devastation when she tells me that my queerness is the worst thing that has ever happened to her. She is boldly and nakedly truthful about how, to her, family is the most important thing. Pairings that bring pregnancy are the most important thing. My womanhood manifesting itself in a child is the most important thing. I almost tell her that I'm really glad that fascist, poverty-stricken, and war-torn 1940s Italy wasn't as bad as I may have previously believed. It's on a Tuesday evening, years later, that my grandmother phones me and takes back every thumbtack that has been lodged in my throat since that conversation. Her apology is the simple elegance of admitting that even the things we don't understand deserve to be accepted when we trust the word of the people we love. My grandmother has told me that she loves me always, forever, without exception, with or without a boyfriend. And that distinction between you are not enough and I love you anyway is a twisted and double-edged reassurance that I would not accept from anybody else and that is softening over time. My grandmother is tiny and old and Italian, and she loves me and she is mine. And this is all that matters. That love is all that matters. That love is a bridge that can be crossed even in translation. That love is what I pick and choose to remember when there is still so much that we both have yet to understand. Thanks, everyone. I submitted a few pieces to a landmark anthology called Here and Now, Queer Italian Canadian Writing, that'll be published by Longbridge Books in June. And for a lot of us, the intersections of our identities, acknowledging them and living in them is a political statement. It is a political truth. Because so many of the people that those identities don't make sense for, like our grandparents who have come from another political environment with other political beliefs, those constant clashes are sites for conflict and sites of discord and sites of courage, I think, because when you have those conversations, that's where you grow as a person. That's where other people grow as people. And those conversations are difficult and they're work, they're labor. So I think we also need to be mindful of the labor that we ask other people to do and how difficult it is for like 95-year-old grandparents to question what might have come before or what they might believe about something. So, and it's interesting because even two people in one couple who have been married for like 50 years, one grandfather will be like, I don't know why you're coming out to me. Like, it's not a big deal. You know, I would like to meet your girlfriend. You know, why is this an issue? And the other grandparent will be like, the whole world is upside down. So sometimes things will take you by surprise, and that's just what life is. So many of the things that happen to us are just stories in the making, and we don't know about it yet. One of the pieces that I submitted to the anthology is an excerpt from my novel, which will be released in 2022, called Catch and Release. And it's about this young woman who comes out as bisexual and who has to navigate this infatuation that she has for a friend of hers, and how it parallels a relationship that she had in high school with a teacher that is revealing itself to be totally inappropriate. And so the story is about how she contends with those two relationships and how they come to a head at some point in her life within the story. So this is an excerpt from the novel. This is where the protagonist decides that she has to go to therapy. Not everybody is fortunate enough to be able to go to therapy, but it's something. I'm glad that the discourse around mental illness and mental health is changing, because the people who are like, nah, therapy is for people who like have huge problems, and I don't need that. That's usually an indication that maybe you would benefit. And there's so much to unpack there. So that's the context for this excerpt that I'm going to read, as a protagonist who realizes, okay, it's time that I talk to a professional about all of these things that are going on. Before my first several sessions at the sexual identity clinic, I sat for 25 minutes in an entryway with cluttered corkboards and sickly yellow walls, waiting to be called in. Every time, my anxiety threatened to choke all the air out of my body as I sat there, almost 30 minutes early for every session. My appointments were always at 9 in the morning on Tuesdays, because I only started class at 11:30. But my day was usually shot after that. The best way I can describe my first therapy sessions is to compare them to throwing up when you have gastro. You feel really empty and drained and a little better, but you're definitely still sick. Sitting in my chair in that entryway on a cushion that was an ugly shade of orange, I thought about walking out of the clinic every single time. My hands were sweaty. I could feel my heart pounding. I think it might have been the 5th session when Dr. Franklin asked me about my anxiety in relation to the clinic itself. "Are you anxious right now?" I smirked. She left the office and returned a few seconds later with a heart rate monitor. It looked like it hadn't seen the light of day since the 1980s, and just the sight of it made me nervous. She pulled up my sleeve and wrapped the band around my upper arm and fixed the clip onto my finger. My resting heart rate was apparently 100 beats per minute. I was either suffering from a heart condition or constantly jogging. "Close your eyes," Dr. Franklin ordered me, removing the contraption and freeing up my arm. "Take a few deep breaths. Take your time." I did. A few minutes later, when she asked me whether I felt calmer, I said yes. She took my heart rate again, and when I opened my eyes, I could see that it had shot up to 120 beats per minute. We concluded that I wasn't too fond of the heart rate monitor, and Dr. Franklin scuttled it back into its dusty pre-21st century holding cell. A half hour later, we checked my heart rate again by counting my pulse for 10 seconds and then multiplying by 6, something I'd done many times at the gym. This time, in the absence of a dusty old contraption that triggered my fear of the unknown and uncontrollable, my heart rate was a normal 62 beats per minute. It reminded me of my drinking that summer and of how good it felt to be completely unselfconscious, how calm I could feel if I managed to be completely outside of my own head. I had always been able to use sleep or study or sport to do that. But now, without alcohol, the only recourse I felt I had left was, ironically, to try being acutely aware of myself in a psychiatrist's office for a whole hour at a time, so that maybe by examining all the different parts of myself, I could eventually learn to keep them from suffocating me from the inside. My first impression of Dr. Franklin when I met her that first session in November was that she was really good with people, which makes sense, and I felt comfortable with her right away. She called me into her office, and instead of turning around to walk straight out of the clinic, I shuffled to her door, stepped into the room, and waited for her motion before I sat down in a bright red sofa chair. It was closer to the ground than it looked, and that made it feel like I'd missed a step going up the stairs, but with my behind. The chair was right beside a large desk, which was covered in sticky notes and books and files and pens and papers. The desk and the sofa chair were arranged side by side so that they faced one another. Behind the desk was an enormous filing cabinet, which filled up another corner of the room. Across from the cabinet was the door in the third corner, and the last corner was home to a huge bookshelf full of textbooks and binders. The wall across from me was papered with diplomas, photos, drawings, and flyers, and all kinds of other things. The office wasn't cluttered, but its small size made it seem fuller than it was. My favorite thing in it was a tiny cactus on the windowsill by the filing cabinet, right across from me. Over the first several months, when we were tackling something really difficult and I felt like I couldn't look Dr. Franklin in the eye, I would talk to the cactus. The first meeting was a get-to-know-each-other session, which I couldn't take too seriously. I don't think a patient is ever supposed to know too much about their psychiatrist, even though I crossed those boundaries pretty quickly. One thing I learned right away was that Dr. Franklin and I would get along. She was sharp and affable and funny. It wouldn't take me long to realize that she was exactly my type. She must have been in her mid-30s or so, average height, short dark hair, blue eyes. I wouldn't describe her as pretty or beautiful necessarily. Instead, I felt that she was dignified, elegant, and attractive. She asked me a lot of basic questions: my height and weight, my family history, my levels of exercise, what I studied at school, what situations made me feel sad or anxious, when I'd started to question my sexuality. I answered everything as honestly as I could. I decided that first morning that I wouldn't be keeping Angela Damon a secret from my therapist. As much as it still hurt, as difficult as it would be to dig up something that still felt so huge and sprawling and terrifying, I knew I would never be able to get away with not mentioning it, and that there would be no point in being a patient at the clinic if I went in with something to hide. I heard myself laying out the facts as if I were describing one of my soccer games. It seemed so ordinary when I said it out loud. But even as I spoke the words, I could feel my heart rate picking up again, because this was supposed to be a secret. This was supposed to be something that I wasn't going to tell anyone. This was supposed to be something I would take to the grave. It became like an addiction, I finished quietly. And I think I became addicted to her because she made me feel like I mattered, like I was important. There was a mountain of other things I wanted to discuss, and we hadn't even scraped the surface. We didn't even talk about Adele that first day. I mentioned her, but obviously she was too big a topic to broach in one session right at the beginning. When I was done explaining about Angela Damon, just the basics, not the details, Dr. Franklin looked at me without saying anything. Then she said, "Isn't that a human thing, to want someone to care about you and to make you feel important?" And then, not unkind, but unabashed, unreserved, she asked, "Why are you crying?" It was my first time crying in front of someone for as long as I could remember. I hadn't been a big crier as a little kid, but as I got older, I learned to cry only alone and in private, if I ever did, in my bed or in an empty room or in a bathroom stall. "It's okay to be human," she said quietly as the tears streamed down my face. After that first session, I found the nearest bathroom and cried for another half hour, feeling like there was something enormous and terrifying that had grabbed hold of me a long time ago, and that I was just starting to understand it. I hadn't answered Dr. Franklin's question. I thought about it a lot after I finally left the hospital, my next appointment scheduled for a month later, just before the holiday break. What I eventually concluded was that my immediate and overwhelming reaction to what she had said about being human and wanting to be cared about and made to feel important was an enormous fountain of relief, and its source was a dark, starving place deep inside me. I'm going to finish off with one last piece. It's called When I Was Younger. When I was younger, I thought that when a driver looked out the back windshield to drive in reverse, they put their hand to the headrest of the passenger seat to protect the person sitting next to them, in case there was an accident while moving backwards. It seemed more likely that there would be an accident while moving backwards. Sometimes moving backwards can be an accident. Sometimes memory is a blow to the back of the head that you inflict on yourself, like when you reopen wounds by mistake, gashes that have been gaping and clamping like broken Venus flytraps for many years now, wounds that are sewn up and torn apart, sewn up and torn apart, sewn up and torn apart. When I drive all over the city in any direction at any given time of the day or night, I try to pretend that I don't know that I'm looking for us, moving backwards by driving forwards past all the street corners and bookstores and coffee shops, hoping to run into the ghosts of two people trading stolen kisses on borrowed time. When we were curled up on your sofa, while your plant sat on the windowsill and watched us cry, did it really matter where we had come from or how we had gotten there? The plants remember all the terrors and painful nothings, all the secrets that ate us alive from the inside out. The plants remember the first I love yous, halting and earnest and raw. They remember the last I love yous, the ones that by then were almost casual, so anchored, so true, they didn't need any extra weight to be grounded in a way that neither of us would doubt. I love yous that were offered as fact, self-evident, like a simple hello or goodbye. I love yous that were effortless and unadorned. The plant saw how it would strike us every time, all over again, how sacred it is to love and be loved with nothing but bodies that are both broken and beautiful, how sometimes even the oldest cliches can feel like the highest truth. With our mangled skin, our tired bones, during that brutal, hellish summer that finished us, our hearts continued to murmur against one another, I have you, I have you, I have you. Why did we apologize for the high notes tumbling out of our mouths? For the way we held one another's names between our teeth? We are not obliged to forgive one another our cruel and careless mistakes. I still remember my lips against your brow bone, your left eye socket. You're right here next to me. I still know that your scent is a shade of bronze that I will never see again. I still know that when someone asks me, what is it that you regret? My answer will be all the things I wrote about all the love I didn't tell anyone about. When I was younger, I never asked myself why a driver put their hand to the headrest of the passenger seat, even when there was no one sitting there, no one to protect in case there was an accident while moving backwards. I never questioned it. I guess I assumed that it was an instinct, or maybe a gesture that you practiced so that you wouldn't forget, so that the next time someone was in the passenger seat, you would know how to protect them. You would remember. Thanks again to everybody for being here. That's it for me. Poems are, and maybe the writers in the room can corroborate this or contribute to this. Poems are constantly being, sometimes they're written and then unwritten and then rewritten. And sometimes you write something down and then it sort of sits there for a few years and then you look back at it and then you realize, I never want to see this again. This is awful. And other times you pick it up and you say, no, there's something here that I can pick up and sort of shape and mold into something new. And I think that that's what one thing that's really reassuring about being a writer is that you leave the different parts of yourself on different bits and pieces of paper in, you know, different parts of your life. And sometimes you can sort of pull it all together and realize, well, this is where I grew. This is where I made a huge mistake. This is another point that I can start from as I keep going on this, you know, this path to the person that I want to be or the writer that I want to be. So thank you to everyone for being here today. Does anyone have any questions or any comments?
Liana, in the excerpt from your novel, when you asked, or the character asked, isn't that a human thing? And the therapist said, it's okay to be human. So that struck me as being, you know, sometimes we need that other person's reinforcement of certain ideas or certain feelings, you know, that we haven't shared with other people, but as a neutral person, that therapist can, you know, validate ourselves as human and what we feel, the emotions we have, and that it is okay. It is okay to cry. It is okay to grieve. It's okay to show those human emotions, you know, to put them out there. And I think when a therapist does that, it allows us to perhaps venture and share, you know, repressed feelings or feelings that we've, you know, kept inside to other people, to be confident, or even you know, to release some of those fears and to open up to others. You know, like I had put a comment in the chat about something my mother had said, you know, when you shared the poem about your nonna, you know, Italian grandmothers, and how, you know, they have strong opinions, they have feelings about how things should be and how things shouldn't be. So it really struck a chord with me, because I thought about when I had to tell my mother that, you know, my marriage was like, I was, you know, about to separate, and I had 2 kids, you know, and it was, you know, you got to stay together for the kids, right? This is what you do. And so it just struck me as how difficult it was at that time for me to share with my mother. And I had told my dad first, and I had a different reaction from my dad as opposed to my mom. So anyway, thank you for sharing that poignant poem and the rest of the flash fiction or poetry that you
Whatever it was,
whatever,
all of that. Thanks for that, Rosanna. I think you're right. Sometimes you need a neutral arbiter to remind you, actually, we live in a capitalist system where if you make a mistake or if you don't respond to a standard, you will be branded as bad, as unproductive, as somehow damaged and inefficient. And sometimes you need a therapist, you know, or somebody, or even somebody in your life with an objective perspective who will say, actually, no, everybody's going to tell you something different. You have to decide what's right for you. And that's probably going to go against a lot of the standards or expectations that have been set for you by other people. So that neutral arbiter and that space to express those feelings, to be human, is really important. So I see Veronica has a question, and then Jules has a question. Veronica, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I really love your work, as you know. So I have a question about politics, because it occurred to me when you read out the poem about your grandmother and how there was a turning around for her to some extent, right? Where she, she came to say that she loved you, and it appears. So I was listening to a podcast recently about this, that when we look at all the different struggles, political struggles, I mean, the one that's gained the most traction is the LGBTQ plus struggle. I mean, it's incredible compared to how things were when I was a kid to how things are now. And I'm not that old. There's been a revolution. I mean, even in the United States, I mean, gay couples can get married. Like never would we have foreseen this, right? And so there are questions about why this struggle has had such positive impacts in the short term. Not to say that there's not tons of more work to be done, for sure, but still. And one of the hypotheses is precisely because any gay, non-binary, bisexual person comes from a family, and that family is usually heterosexual, I mean, for the most part. And so these family ties kind of force us, the love that we have for our grandchildren, for instance, kind of compels us to rechange our worldview. And then that kind of opens up to all the other non-binary, lesbians, whatever, right? And so I was wondering whether you had any suggestions, like on a political level. Is there something you think that other victims, and I'm thinking here, racialized people, people with a low income, people with mental health disorders, like whether there are any lessons that you think could be drawn from your experience? That was my question.
That's a really good question. I think that I can obviously speak from a personal perspective about being a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that, like you said, the slight difference between that sort of movement and some of the others and some of the other fights that we're involved in is those family ties and is the stories that we tell. It's a lot easier to sympathize and to understand someone once you know them and you've heard their story and they're not some stranger far away. So when sometimes, our friends or our peers or our colleagues challenge us about our microaggressions or our racial biases or the way we participate in systems and institutions of oppression, it's very easy to get defensive because we feel threatened. And especially if it's not from someone we know, if it's not from someone we're very close to, if it's a colleague at work who says, you made this comment and that was totally inappropriate, we feel very upset. And those of us who strive to be good allies, there's almost more of that at play because all of a sudden we're not a good ally anymore. And then we feel terrible. And then we center it on our feelings and how we feel. So one thing that I think might translate would be the openness that family members feel they have to have to their young, queer children or queer grandchildren because of that tie. And that's the thing, being tied to a family member that holds so much weight and so much significance. And when it comes to accepting your queer grandchildren, for example, that's something that maybe not leverage probably isn't the right word, but something that you can use to your advantage, something that will keep you going along that path. Conversely, if you have family members or friends or people who are close to you who are abusive, that tie is precisely not a reason to stay close to them. But I think that closeness and that openness and that willingness to accept and to listen is something that can extend beyond our family. And so to beyond our circle, so that it can encompass the other people in our lives who live at different intersections, who experience socioeconomic hardship, who are disabled or differently abled, who have a radically different life experience from ours. So if we're looking to be good allies or to help sort of move along those fights and those areas of activism, I think one thing that can translate from the queer sphere to the others is everybody's a person, everybody has a story, everybody is somebody else's family member. So if we remember that and we let that inform our perspective, I think we'll be more likely to listen. So many of the fight for equality and for social justice, so much of that is hampered by, well, maybe if you asked more nicely, maybe if you didn't break store windows, maybe if you had put your hands up, maybe if you hadn't moved too quickly. There's all these excuses that are born from how far removed we are from the situation, and for many of us, how privileged we are. So to try to shed that, I think, would be really helpful. I hope that answers your question.
It did. Thank you.
Jules, you also have a question.
Yeah, so it's like a bit of a question comment, just kind of an idea to share. But I find that whenever I listen to your poetry, it's always like very deeply moving, like deeply like easy to connect in very personal ways. But it strikes me how poetry is this thing that is equally profoundly personal, but also like deeply public. That once you put it out there, once you create this art, it's meant to be shared. It's meant to be, in a sense, like consumed and interacted with by everyone else. And I don't know if there's like a specific question or just like a realm of topic, but like the idea that you are putting this like very profound part of yourself out there for everyone else to see, and like that vulnerability is just a very like wonderful part of poetry. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, what are your kind of thoughts on that, like internal, like, or like inherent conflict or dichotomy in poetry
between the personal and the public, and the personal, the private and the political, and how all of those things sort of converge? That's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is all of the young poets that I've seen who take the personal and make it public before they're ready. So, and this is not something we've done so much anymore, and it's different on Zoom. But when performances were public and in front of crowds, and you had that different connection with your audience, I saw a number of poets get up there and feel that their poetry and their performance would be more impactful if their pain and their trauma was on full display for everyone to see. It depends on the kind of audience member that you are, but usually if you are re-traumatizing yourself on stage with something personal that you have not processed enough for it to be public, you are also re-traumatizing your audience. And so I'd be inclined to say that's irresponsible of you as a performer, but I'd also be inclined to say that if you're not aware of that, that's just because you haven't had the means or the opportunity to address that, and you're using poetry as your therapy, which is not wrong. But there's a difference between reading from your journal, which is where I think a lot of poems start, and reading from something that you've pulled from your journal and that you've crafted. So when I think about the poems that I want to perform in front of any kind of audience, and I go through my set list, there will be some that I won't perform anymore because they're too far removed and I can't access them. I can't access those feelings in the same way that I did before to perform them convincingly. So it's too far. And some of them are too close. I wrote them too recently, or that the poem feels like it's finished, but it's not. There are a couple of still, minor edits to do, and the processing that I have to do is still not complete. So if I'm reading it and I feel, there are too many feelings here, and that's just for the private, that's just for, myself or any collaborators I might be working with or any people who are close to me. And that's separate from the public. And that's the thing about poetry, is that it is very, very personal, and the personal is universal. And that's why people connect in many ways so closely and so intensely with poems. But there is also a part of yourself when you're a performer that you have to keep just for you. And you always run the risk of performing your own authenticity, which is something that I know poets, we talk about and think about. How do I perform authentically without laying my soul bare in a way that's dangerous and uncomfortable for everybody watching? And how do I not seem contrived or frankly performative, even though this is a performance? So it's something that's different for everyone. but it's definitely something to keep in mind is how do I be true to myself? How do I stay true to my work? How do I give a good and responsible and entertaining performance? And how do I keep it all together so that everybody is safe and everybody feels okay? So it's something that's in constant negotiation. Thanks for your question, for your comment. I think there's a question in the chat from Maria Pia. Does writing like the ones you read energize or exhaust you during the process? It's very, very different on Zoom. It's so different on Zoom. In person, I remember it was the biggest performance I had done to date. I performed at Montreal Pride in 2019, and I was the first performer, and they asked me to open the show. And I was having like a difficult time that was a little bit related to the poems that I was doing, and I was very nervous. And one of the organizers sort of came up to me. There were a bunch of us. It was a show called Place à la Relève, and there were different poets and dancers and singers, and all of us were preparing for the performance in a different way. So some of us were really loud and really, boisterous, and some of us were very quiet. They called us the quiet queers. And so the organizers would come and talk to us, be like, "You're a quiet queer. I'm worried about you." And in the end, everybody was fine. But I just remember being so petrified and then putting one foot on the stage. My whole body wasn't even on the stage, just one foot on the stage to get up and go to the microphone. And it was like a switch. It was fine because I'd switched from me as a person into me as a performer. And those two states are distinct, but tied together at the same time. So live, it's a lot easier to be energized instead of exhausted. And I think you're especially more likely to be energized if you have done the work and you have processed, and the poems are just the performance. That said, I'll give performances even on Zoom, and I'll do 2 or 3 in a day with students or with different or teachers. And then I'll wonder at 3 or 4 p.m. after a few workshops or a few performances why I'm tired. I'll be like, why am I tired? I don't understand. I've been sitting down all day. It's because there is still an expenditure of energy there. There is still work and effort that maybe doesn't, if you're exhausted, that's something to be worried about. If you're tired, I think that's normal. So I think it's a little bit of both. I know that if I am performing and writing responsibly, I'm more likely to feel energized instead of exhausted. One thing I will say is that drained is never something that I've experienced so far. And if I feel drained after anything, I'll know that's maybe not something I want to do again. Thanks to everyone for the comments in the chat. If there are any further questions, I'd be happy to take them. But thank you so much for being here and for participating. It's always lovely to have a group of people come together and to hold space, because as a performer, you need that space. You need that space you need an audience to hold that space for you. And that's a gift that the audience offers you. So I want to thank you all for that. Carmelo asks about language and how do you approach the issue of clarity versus ambiguity? That's a good question. That is a good question. I think that it's always important to be, and this is where, the poet will jump in and be like, well, it's both. You can be clear in your ambiguity. You can be ambiguous in the clarity that you present. I think that it's important when you write poems to use language that is very, very precise and very, very descriptive. So that's where the clarity comes in. But the feelings themselves sometimes remain ambiguous. And I think that that's okay, because that ambiguity leaves room for personal interpretation. So I would say that the language has to be very, very clear. But I think that if something is too clear and too systematic, it takes away some of the ambiguity and the mystery and the space that people have for processing the poem in their own way. Exactly. Ambiguity opens up possibilities for different meanings that different people can assign to the work that you do. It looks like that's it for questions. Thank you very much to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Please mark your calendars for my next reading, which will be on May 30th at noon. Noon is sort of the poet's time. And this free event on Zoom was brought to you actually by the Canadian Council for the Arts and the Writers Union of Canada. It's a part of the Books and Biscotti literary series. And I want to thank the Association of Italian Canadian Writers and Accenti magazine for making this possible, and all of you as well for your presence and your participation here today. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great Sunday and see you next time.